Hey, good morning, Parag. Pardon my congestion. I caught something this weekend. Here's some things about your research model that I think have to be addressed. I'd like to see you address them anyway. The first one is on explicit knowledge and what transfers, what is lost, and what's kept inside the organization. I think there's three parts to it. That if you have some kind of explicit knowledge or even tacit knowledge inside the organization, tacit knowledge being inside the head of the people, that there's a certain amount of it that transfers to the IT outsourcer. There's a certain amount that is lost to the organization due to people departing the organization, but we didn't capture that knowledge before they left and it didn't transfer to the IT. And then there's the knowledge that remains after you've transferred and after whatever's been lost has been lost. So I think there's three components to the original block of knowledge that was inside the organization. And then depending on how many people are downsized or outsourced, then the amount that is actually lost, the drain, may or may not be significant. If you have a lot of redundancy already, there may not actually be any drain, although I think everybody knows some things that only they know. The second thing has to do with culture and different populations. So let me talk about the populations first. I think there's at least six groups of people that are involved here. You have managers who are inside the organization, so this big block represents the organization, and then this little one is the IT organization that we're outsourcing to. And so you have the managers who are responsible for developing the plan and implementing it for the client. And then you have some people in the organization who are possessing the core skills, the competencies of that organization. Those are the guys who are adding value to the organization. And they're probably not IT, but they use IT to support them. So these folks are just keeping their jobs, and their concern, I think, is going to be, am I still being supported by IT so I can do what I need to do, and may not really care whether that's in-house or outsourced. They may not even detect the difference. Then I think there are three sets of people that are working in IT that could be affected by the outsourcing. There's going to be some number, just straight up IT, who are going to lose their jobs. There's going to be a number that stay in IT, whose job it is going to be interface with the IT section on the IT outsourcing company on an ongoing basis. So they're like contract support supervisors, where these two groups may have been doing the job before. You've retained a guy or two, or you've trained some people who can ensure that the new IT outsourcing support is meeting the standards of the rest of the organization. So they've got to translate requirements into performance. I see that happen a lot in the Army, where we used to have Department of the Army civilians actually performing maintenance work to fix tanks and howitzers, and then we outsourced the maintenance capability, and the only guy that we kept was the manager who used to run the shop, and now he becomes a contract supervisor, ensuring that those guys are meeting the contract specifications. So that's what I mean by an IT guy who stays in IT, but whose job is to interface with IT. Then you may have some number of IT folks who are going to be retrained and retained inside the organization for whatever reason, part of a personnel development. It's possible that they were maybe some IT managers who can be taught to manage something else or move into sales or into production, but for whatever reason you've decided that you want to keep them, but then retrain them. So I really think there are at least 5 different populations inside the organization who have different levels of IT knowledge, both implicit and explicit, and who, once you decide to downsize, may or may not have, when they leave, take some of that essential IT knowledge with them. Then you were talking about the effect of culture on the organization, and so certainly I think there is a you got to address the culture of the gaining IT organization, and then the culture of the management that's developing the plan. If they are culturally not in sync, it may be difficult for them to develop a mutual plan that is seamless. There may be unspoken assumptions that causes problems in transition. So there's the possibility of lack of cultural fit between those two organizations. Now, there may or may not be one master culture overall for this organization. The larger it is, the greater the possibility, I think, that there's a set of subcultures inside that organization that may affect the quality of the transition plan. For instance, you may have these the IT workers who are losing their jobs, the line or production workers in IT, who may have their own particular, dare I say, geek culture, where they kind of hang together and don't really connect well to the rest of the organization except on technical support. The people who stay may share some of that IT culture. So there's a possibility of subcultures inside this organization depending on how large it is. So I think you got to be really careful about how you decide to incorporate the cultural value when you look at its effect on the transfer of knowledge. If there's a big disconnect between the management culture and that of IT, then in my view there's a good possibility that you're going to have more culture drain because these guys don't have a vested interest in helping the management that decided to fire him. Or this might be an enlightened culture that really goes above and beyond to ensure that these guys get very good placement later on. And so in order to maintain that quality relationship and stay connected to that strong leadership culture, they may actually experience less knowledge drain because these guys have some sense of loyalty to the organization and to the management, and they don't want to burn any bridges. So again, when you talk about culture, there's the possibility for subcultures inside the organization, and then also between the organization as a whole and IT. And then if there's some requirement for these guys that were in IT in the transition phase, the cultural relationship between the workers in IT here and the IT outsourced workers, that could be a cause of friction, or it could be a cause of strength in terms of developing the transition plan. Finally, on the subject of planning, we know from Kotter, the Kotter change model, Kotter, that one of the reasons plans fail is because of poor transition and poor execution. And so Kotter model suggests that folks go through 8 deliberate steps to ensure that there's a transition and execution plan as well as a master plan, and that there are a couple small victories to gain momentum are designed first so that you take it in stages. Well, depending on how you write your survey, you're going to be asking people to comment on perhaps what were the strengths and weaknesses during the planning, the transition, and execution. Or you may just be simple at this and just say, hey, when you were outsourced, or when IT was outsourced, what were the strengths and weaknesses, or something like that, or what was the effect on knowledge drain, how much knowledge was lost. So I think you have to decide how you want to represent the phases of the plan if you want to go that far, or do you want to just take it as one giant plan going from the old status quo to the new status quo? Are you going to treat it as 3 separate phases, like there's a planning phase, and then when that stops, the transition begins, and then when the transition ends, then true execution really begins? Now, in my view, when you start looking at the direct effects on performance of the IT outsourcing decision, I think you have to put a finite limit on how far into the future we're going to attribute improvement or underperformance to the plan itself. Like if there was a company that transitioned to outsourcing in 2005, is it really fair to say that problems they have in 2013, 8 years later, can still be traced back to the decision to IT outsource. So much water's gone under the bridge that it's no longer fair to attribute it back to the IT outsourcing decision, perhaps. So I think in order to be able to compare self-reporting people, that I think it's fair to the IT plan to say, hey, there's a limit on how far into the future during execution that you can attribute problems directly to IT. And that's if you, in this diagram, if you, I've arrayed this as a distinct planning, transitioning, execution. You also you have to make a decision. Do you want to represent it that way if you decide to go with phases, or could there be some moment where you are you are only planning, and then at some point you begin some small transitions, like in a Cotter model. So at this point in time, what you have is mostly planning but some transition, and then you might go to the planning is over and you go to complete transition, and then at some point they're into what I would call production. That is full up service, for the long haul. We've already started to implement the new status quo in a few leading areas until such time as we've moved the entire organization out of transition and into the steady state status quo. So I think you've got to at least think your way through the decision of how you want to array the transition operation as just one complete whole and ask for people's insights, or do you want to break it up into planning, transition, and execution? And if so, are those separate phases, or is there some kind of overlap? As you go towards the overlap, that becomes increasingly complex for you to represent. So that's an important design decision that you got to solve before you get to your survey. Okay, I'll have some other comments to make too about your process model, just for points of clarification, but I owe you a separate diagram on that. Anyway, I'll stop right there and encourage you. You've made a really good first start. Keep going, and I'll give you some detailed notes in the marked up dissertation this week. Thanks.